Today we're digging into a topic that's suddenly everywhere again: Canada's trade tensions. And we're going to zoom in on one surprisingly emotional flashpoint: alcohol, plus the bigger question behind it all. What concessions might the US actually offer, and what trade irritants are still sitting on the table, waiting to flare up? It's wild how quickly trade disputes become personal when the product is something people recognize. Lumber and dairy matter, obviously, but they're abstract for a lot of folks. Alcohol is not abstract. The moment you hear a provincial ban on US alcohol, you can picture store shelves, restaurant menus, and people asking, wait, can they just do that?
Let's start there. Provinces in Canada have a lot of power over how alcohol is sold, because most provinces control distribution through provincial liquor boards and related rules. So when we say a provincial ban, we're often talking about a province choosing not to stock certain products, or pulling them from shelves, or limiting procurement.
And that's where the politics get interesting. Because a province isn't imposing a tariff at the border. It's using its role as the gatekeeper of retail and distribution. The practical effect can look a lot like a trade retaliation, but it's happening inside the province's own system.
Which leads to the obvious question: why would a province do that? Usually it's framed as leverage, a signal, a way to say, if you're going to hit our exports, we can create pain too. And alcohol is a very visible lever.
Visible, but not necessarily the biggest lever economically. The real story is that alcohol bans are often more about messaging than maximizing dollars. People notice them. Media covers them. And it can rally domestic support because it feels like standing up for the home team.
Right, and that home team framing matters in Canada. U.S. disputes. The relationship is close, but it's also competitive and sometimes touchy. It doesn't take much for frustrations to boil over, especially when one side feels the other is playing hardball.
So what are the usual ingredients that create this tension? Let's talk trade irritants. These are the recurring disputes that don't always become full-blown crises, but they never really disappear.
The classic examples are things like market access fights, rules about procurement, regulatory differences, and complaints about subsidies or protections. And then there are sector-specific flashpoints that can become symbolic: agriculture supply management, energy policies, manufacturing rules, and cross-border standards.
And when irritants pile up, even a small new move can set off a chain reaction. One side announces a policy. The other side calls it unfair. Then comes the pressure campaign. Industry groups, politicians, media. And suddenly people are talking about retaliation.
Which brings us back to alcohol. If a province limits U.S. products, the U.S. side can interpret it as hostile, even if it's legal within the province's system. And that creates a second layer of tension. Not just the original trade dispute, but the response to the response.
Here's another wrinkle. Provinces are not all the same. One province might want to make a point quickly and loudly. Another might be more cautious, thinking about local businesses, restaurant owners, and the optics of punishing consumers.
And if you're an American producer, you might be thinking, wait, I didn't set U.S. policy. Why am I losing shelf space? That's the downside of these targeted moves. They can spread frustration beyond governments to businesses and consumers.
Okay, so if provinces can apply pressure through alcohol distribution, what does the other side have? Let's talk about U.S. concessions. When tensions rise, everybody wants to know, what could the U.S. offer that would actually cool things down?
A concession can be a direct policy change, but it can also be something quieter: a pause in enforcement, a carve-out, an exemption, a timeline adjustment, a side agreement, or a commitment to a process that prevents surprises.
And often the most realistic concession isn't a dramatic reversal. It's a reduction in uncertainty. Businesses don't just hate tariffs. They hate not knowing what the rules will be next quarter. So concessions sometimes look like clarity and predictability.
There's also the idea of trading irritants for irritants. We'll ease up here if you ease up there. Governments like symmetry. It lets them say they defended their interests while still landing a deal.
But that's where it gets complicated. Because what Canada wants and what a province wants aren't always identical. And what the US federal government can deliver quickly can be limited by domestic politics, legal constraints, and pressure from US industries.
So imagine you're trying to craft a de-escalation package. What would be on your checklist? First, stop the bleeding. Freeze or roll back whatever triggered the latest flare-up. Second, create a pathway for ongoing disputes, a working group, a formal consultation process, or a schedule for negotiations. Third, offer something each side can present as a win.
And that win might be as simple as ending a symbolic retaliation. If US products return to shelves, that becomes a visible sign that relations are stabilizing. It's not just economics, it's a headline people understand.
Now, let's be honest. Some irritants stick around even after a deal. A lot of Canada, you did us. Tension isn't because the countries dislike each other. It's because their economies are deeply integrated. The more you trade, the more chances you have to disagree.
And because industries are integrated, retaliation can backfire. If you hit a product category, you may also hit your own businesses that rely on those imports, your own restaurants that already have thin margins, or your own distributors who built supply chains around variety.
That's why some leaders prefer targeted, reversible measures. Alcohol restrictions can be turned on and off relatively quickly, compared to rebuilding an entire tariff schedule or rewriting regulations.
But reversibility cuts both ways. If a tool is easy to use, it can become a habit. And if both sides get used to symbolic retaliation, you end up with a relationship that feels permanently one bad week away from another flare-up.
So what's the big takeaway for listeners trying to make sense of it? When you hear about a provincial ban on U.S. alcohol, it's not just about beer, wine, or spirits. It's about leverage in a broader negotiation, and it's about how domestic systems, like provincial liquor distribution, can become tools in international disputes.
And when you hear talk of U.S. concessions, don't just listen for a dramatic announcement. Watch for the smaller things, exemptions, timelines, enforcement choices, and commitments to consult before acting. Those are often the real pressure valves.
One last question before we wrap. What should people watch next if they want to gauge whether tensions are getting better or worse? I'd say, look for whether both sides are speaking in win-win language or fairness and punishment language. The tone tells you where negotiations are headed.
And watch the signals from provinces as well as the federal government. If provinces start reversing restrictions or quietly restocking, that can be an early hint that a broader understanding is forming, even before a formal deal is announced.
At the end of the day, Canada and the U.S. don't have the luxury of disengaging. The relationship is too big, too close, and too practical. That's why these irritants matter, and why the smartest outcomes usually involve de-escalation, clear rules, and a way to keep disputes from turning into a public brawl.
And if you're listening from either side of the border, the best lens might be this. Trade fights are rarely just about a single product. They're about precedent, leverage, and domestic politics. Alcohol just happens to be the kind of product that makes the abstract feel very real, very fast.
That's it for today. If you want more episodes like this, we can also dig into how provincial powers intersect with international trade rules, or how businesses plan for cross-border uncertainty. Until next time, take care